I am Michael Taylor, Program Coordinator for Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration. Welcome to our quarterly reentry table. This session will be on Policy 2026, removing barriers, improving supports, transforming lives, and improving safety. We have a panel for you guys this afternoon. It's been a long day. Ken said that earlier in our prep meeting. Man, it's been a long week and it's only Tuesday. It has been. Today we plan on talking to you guys about state and local policies that either help returning citizens succeed post incarceration or put obstacles in their way that impede reintegration. Learn what policy proposals advocates in Michigan are pushing for to expand reentry support and remove obstacles, and learn how you can help make them a success. Hear from state and national leaders on topics such as fair chance housing, coming home reentry ready with vital documents, dismantling barriers to employment, and providing achievement credits from parole. Again, welcome to our quarterly reentry table. You guys know MI-CEMI, but a quick introduction. We support people and organizations on the front lines working to improve public safety and end mass incarceration. We do that by standing in four pillars, technically six, but we prevent our incarceration. We stand in ending excessive sentencing, promoting rehabilitation, improving reentry, and the sub pillars of reinvesting in the community and doing narrative change. We have about 115 plus members inside of our organization, and we are, of course, non-partisan, non-religious, all-inclusive organization. And yeah, oh, and we also have members that are incarcerated currently as well as formerly incarcerated. Our agenda for today, of course, welcome. We will have a presentation from Tony Gant on fair chance housing. Then we will have a presentation about reentry for all who need it from Nation Outside, Cameron Colts. From Safe and Just Michigan, Ken Nixon will present on expanding healthcare employment opportunities. Ali Fonsetti and Prison Fellowship will discuss professional licensing, pre-approval, income supported reentry from Sam Hanna and the Center for Employment Opportunities. And lastly, Chuck will round us out to discuss some of the updates on vital docs and budget advocacy. Then we'll have a quick Q&A session, allowing for you guys to get some more information on what was presented, and I will hopefully get you out of here in time to have the rest of your day. And our goals for the day always are to connect, collaborate, and share strategy. So we are all in here with the same goal to end mass incarceration. We are connecting with reentry providers, advocates, and returned citizens across the state to learn from and support each other. Collaboration so that together we can more effectively support people returning from incarceration, and a shared strategy so we can build power and move with alignment to change policies, procedures, and practices so returning citizens have better support and fewer obstacles to successful reentry. And I like this quote: effective reentry rebuilds lives, enriches communities, promotes safety, and saves money by preventing reincarceration. And that being said, drum roll, please. Our first presenter for the day is my big brother, Tony Gant. He will be talking to us about fair chance housing.
Good afternoon and happy Tuesday to everybody. It's been a long day already, but I'm excited to talk about the Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act and fair chance in general, right? So the Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act was reintroduced this session by Senator Mary Cavanaugh, and that Senate bill is 738. It was also introduced in the Michigan House of Representatives by Representative Stephanie Young, right? And that House bill is 5355. And kind of is framing. We've been working, and I'm working with my colleagues at the Vera Institute of Justice Opening Doors campaign, which is a national campaign to address the housing access problem that people, formerly incarcerated people, face, or people with conviction histories in a general way. I've personally been working on this issue for a lot of years. And so this session, we're really hoping to keep moving the ball forward. Last session, we got a number of committee hearings in the Michigan House of Representatives. I want to say we did at least 2 committee hearings. We did a lot of advocacy last session, and the bill still died in committee at really close to lame duck, right when lame duck died in the House last session. But we did get a lot of progress in the bill. When the bill was initially introduced by Representative Abraham Ayash, the bill got no traction the first time it was introduced, and the second time we got at least 2 committee hearings. This will be the third introduction of the Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act, and we're hoping to at least get a Senate hearing and perhaps even a Senate vote. But just to be really sober, the Michigan House of Representatives is a minefield right now. Not a lot of progressive legislation is going to go through the Michigan House of Representatives, but we're going to continue to beat the drum beat. Like I said, we've been working on this on the local level as well. We now have 6 cities in Michigan that have fair chance housing ordinances. We can talk about Kalamazoo has one, Jackson has one, Ann Arbor has one, Detroit has one, Flint has one, and even Pontiac has an ordinance that requires landlords at least do go through an individualized assessment before they deny someone for criminal history, which kind of sets the stage for talking about the Michigan Fair Chance Access to Housing Act, which at its core is trying to make sure that people with criminal convictions can have access to housing. For people with criminal convictions, this is one of the most difficult barriers we face, right? People like current day, it's easier to get a job than when I came home in 2015. But nevertheless, one of the problems that remains very hard is to get somewhere to live if you have a criminal conviction. And that lasts for almost all the time that you had that criminal conviction. Now, I will say that in Michigan, we expanded expungement laws, right? So a lot of people have been able to get their record clear, but there are still a number of us who will never be able to get our convictions cleared. And so now, no matter how far we go in rebuilding our lives, we're always going to face this, unless we purchase a house, we're always going to face this barrier of trying to get access to housing, which is the fair chance housing movement in a sense, right? Local and state. We know that formerly incarcerated people are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public, right? 10 times. We know that in Michigan, we have some of the highest parental incarceration rates in the nation, right? 1 in 10 children in Michigan have a parent that is either currently incarcerated or has been incarcerated. The reason I bring that up is because housing access is not just me, right? As a formerly incarcerated person, because I have a son, my inability to get housing also impacts my son, right? We know that parental incarceration impacts children as it goes to education, but it also impacts them as it goes to having housing access, right? And so the way the legislation works is similar to ban the box, right? We push the question of whether or not you have a criminal conviction further back in the process. So first, the prospective landlord would ask the prospective tenant all the other questions, right? Do you make enough money? Do you some landlords don't want you to have pets? Do you have a pet? All the other questions except the criminal conviction will be discussed first, right? And if the prospective landlord is happy with all those questions, the landlord will issue the tenant a conditional lease. That conditional lease will say, hey, you fit all the criteria. Think you would be a great tenant. I want to run a background check. The way the legislation is set up, the landlord would then run the background check. We have a 3-year look back period, right? In this legislation, meaning that only crimes from the last 3 years are the crimes that the landlord should be looking at. We did have some carve outs. Those carve outs are human trafficking, arson, and the 2 carve outs that are mandated by HUD. The 2 HUD required carve outs are if somebody is on the lifetime sexual registry and if you have been convicted of manufacturing meth within a home in the past, right? Those are HUD required carve outs. And so the landlord then assesses the person. And if a person hasn't had a criminal conviction in the last 3 years and is not part of those 4 carve outs, the person should get access to housing. Now, if they don't, the way the legislation is set up, the complaint can go to the attorney general. And the attorney general is then supposed to, like any other complaint that goes to the AG, Under this legislation, the AG can then take the landlord to task to ensure that they're not discriminating against people with criminal histories. And I know I got 8 minutes. I'm gonna stop, but I want to say that while we may not get this done this session, we're still working locally as well, right? And we're planning to come back next session. This is one of those big issues that we got to get done in Michigan if we want to see real access to economic opportunities for folk. Because if you get a job and don't have somewhere to live, you're not gonna keep that job long. A lot of formerly incarcerated people are couch surfing, living in family members' basement. This has a huge impact on our population, right? So we're working locally in Lansing, we're working locally in Saginaw, and we're working locally in Grand Rapids with partners. And my ask to everybody, right, is that one, I'm gonna put my information in, connect with me, because I want folk to come out when we get to Senate hearing to testify. Two, if you're in those three local cities I just mentioned, connect with me because we got to go to city council, right? We got to start moving this ball. We got to keep beating this drum beat. Otherwise, we're not going to get this big win. This is important. This is really important. Thank you for the time.
Man, that was on point, my brother. I appreciate that. And you right on time, right? So moving right along. For sure, I do want to add that that has really been an issue for me. I just had a conversation with somebody yesterday about how easy it was for me to get a job getting out of prison, but 10 years after coming home from prison, still struggle with housing. I personally have finally gotten to a housing situation that is comfortable, but last year this time we were having a real struggle when it came to getting housing for me and my family. So that's a real challenge. That being said, we have a presentation. Camera, my guy don't have a picture up right now because you're just getting in the mix of this thing. But we got the Nation Outside logo up for you. But Cameron Coach is going to discuss the need for reentry support for everybody, for all.
All
The
right.
floor is
Thank
yours,
you,
brother.
Mike. First off, I want to say good afternoon. My name is Cameron Coates. I'm the community navigator for the Tri-County area in Michigan, which includes Macomb, Wayne, and Oakland. Yeah, so like Mike saying, the support who need it is essentially everybody don't come home with OS services. So if it's an individual, OS services is usually once you are paroled under certain stipulations, the state will assist you with certain things, whether it's training, housing, um, education, simple things like that. Well, the reality of it is that it's individuals who come home who don't receive those services, whether they have maxed out, they have essentially are federal parolees, as well as just individuals who don't fall under those guidelines. So it's something we need to do about that. Currently at Nation Outside, we assist them with services. So we try to assist them getting identification because they don't may not have that. That come through OS services a lot of times when guys don't have the funds or the resources to get that. Um, as Tony was saying, um, if you don't have housing, you can't get an ID. You have to have that verification, as well as when you are a part of OS, they give you that. They give you halfway housing, which give you an address, which you can receive DHS services, get you Medicaid, bridge card, anything in that. Actually sign up for school. With you not having a house or a place to go to, it is it like Tony said, it affects you deeply. It don't allow you to really have that family unification. Um, Currently, our policies affect us to the point where it affects where we go, where we do, who we commune with. How do you feel like you are returning and actually providing, being a part of this process of the political process of actually getting out and being engaging, being a citizen. The a lot of times when we come home, we are put in a place of we're back and we have a constant reminder of the poor choices we made throughout life. We look at we need that fair chance and we need that assistance. We need that support within the community. So things you can do to assist us is first off go to nationoutside.org and follow our newsletter. Become engaged. We are about to start posting up for monthly and bi-monthly engagement meetings. So we want to be on the lookout for that, as well as if you can donate your time when we have events. That'll be a bit beneficial. I'll put my information down in the chat as well. Um, Guys come home and not have the simple things of hats, coats, gloves, basic necessities that we take advantage of. Um, Throughout your time, we'll be doing different drives for things like that for hygiene products because they don't get that when they come home unless you have OS services. So that is a hindrance in within itself. You don't have the confidence to take care of yourself. You don't feel like going to get that place. Also, we are introducing digital literacy. It's important that when you come home, a lot of our older gentlemen and ladies that's been gone for so long don't have. I mean, you be gone for 3 years and you see how your phone can change on you. The new features they include in it. So we have individuals who've never had that assistance at all. As well as we want to sit there and make sure we assist those who've been exonerating and make sure they're getting them services that they need with housing. We are looking into expanding into housing, working with different community organizations as well as landlords to possibly have a list generated where we can help that. So, anything anybody want to add? Mike, you want to add anything to?
Oh, sir, I appreciate that. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Sek. You had something to add?
yeah. So, um, when Cameron shared this, I want to make sure folks followed, right? So the services that are provided are through OS, Offender Success. We don't like to call it that because we don't like to label folks offenders. But you're not eligible if you're not on parole. So people who max out their sentences aren't getting services. People who are exonerated. Ken Nixon's going to be up in a minute talking about healthcare employment, but a lot of the folks who are exonerated, not eligible for the services. And often when somebody is resentenced, they may not end up being on parole during after they're released, so they're also not eligible. In the short term, what I dropped into the chat is there's two bills, a House bill and a Senate bill, that would extend eligibility for these services to people who are resentenced or exonerated. So that this is a partial step forward. So another way you can help is by reaching out to your elected official and supporting these bills. But that's not going to fully solve the problem that Cameron's naming because it doesn't cover people who max out from their services, right? Like if you serve your full maximum sentence, when you come home, you're not on parole. That there's an advantage like that. You're not under supervision. You're not worried about getting violated from your parole and ending up on back in prison for a status violation, but it also means you're not getting the support you need from that. So we've got a short-term campaign with these two bills and then the long-term effort to make sure that everybody who's coming home has access to those services. So just wanted to lift those ones up as well.
Thank you, Chuck.
Appreciate that. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I also want to highlight to acknowledge that the long-term look at this thing is the reality that everybody that needs reentry assistance doesn't necessarily fit a specific criteria. Um, if you've been to prison, you probably need some level of reentry assistance, whether you even know it or not. And I'm speaking from my own personal experience. I did 17 years. I had a strong support system when I came home and appeared to not need a lot of assistance. I came to find myself having a lot of challenges where if somebody would have been able to just kind of help navigate me through that, I would not have bumped my head against some of the walls that I ran into. So that's just an added thing. That being said, you on deck, Ken. Talk a little bit about what's going on over at Safe and Just Michigan when it comes to healthcare employment, because that's a big one right now.
Kenneth Nixon from Safe and Just Michigan. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Partnerships. One of the bills that we are working on is removing conviction-based barriers to the healthcare industry. One thing that we've learned is this is a very nuanced space. The federal government has established a list of convictions that will exclude people from working in certain spaces that work for organizations that receive Medicaid or Medicare money from the federal government. The state of Michigan itself added its own list of convictions to uh, what the federal government had already established, making the list a lot longer than it already was. And then you have some private institutions that also added their own convictions. So, with all that being said, we project that between now and 2032, we will have a shortage of close to 62,000 nurses. As we all know, urgent care is severely lacking. It's not urgent anymore. The healthcare industry is bleeding employees faster than they can keep them. And this has created a problem for the industry as a whole. And some of our research across the state of Michigan over the past couple of years, what we've learned is not everybody at the top even knows they have these policies. A lot of the leadership in some of these hospitals and some of the larger companies don't even know these policies existed. So we are looking to remove some of these barriers from the state legislation itself. We believe that companies and organizations should be able to hire who they want to hire based off of where they see fit. Um, if in the event and when that this legislation passes, we predict that close to 500,000 people in the state of Michigan can get back to work. The organizations that we've had conversations with um, have quickly realized that this is a problem. They've got a problem with their bottom line, and this is a solution to their bottom line. When it comes to the convictions themselves, some of the organizations that we've had conversations with, um, we quickly realized that they have these blanket policies, meaning that in some organizations, a misdemeanor, any misdemeanor, could prevent you from working in certain positions for close to 5 years. That's a problem because jaywalking is technically a misdemeanor. Not paying a traffic ticket on time could get you a misdemeanor. That misdemeanor could wreck your entire career for several years. This, and for us, the things that people are being perpetually punished for have nothing to do with their ability to perform CPR or their ability to stop somebody from bleeding. The things that people are being punished for have nothing to do with the things they've been trained for. So for us, it's a huge problem in the time in society where we very well know the healthcare industry needs as many people as it can get. Our work on this issue is specifically around removing conviction-based barriers. And let's be clear and be honest. Like, we want common sense changes, right? We don't want someone that has been convicted of drugs or drug use working in a pharmacy, right? We don't want someone that has gone through their own troubles with their own family working around children, right? We're not asking for blankets. We're asking for common sense. So, for us, those are the conversations that we're having as we push this legislation in hopes of getting it done this year. We've had great reception from the the hospital industry overall. They are very on board. We've had great conversations with a lot of the business industry. We've also had great conversations with the MDOC. One of the reasons that there is no healthcare training in the MDOC because they didn't see a reason to do it when people couldn't be hired in certain areas with a conviction. They are on board to start the training in the event that we get this change. So as you know, this is something that will be huge for people being released from incarceration with actual formal training on how to step right into an industry that needs employees. The call to action on this, talk to your legislators like, as much as possible. This is a huge issue, but it's also a huge issue I think everybody agrees with. We have not had any negative pushback from anybody that we've discussed this issue with, but they still need to hear from the community, need to hear from people that have been impacted by this. We've had conversations with people from across the country, across the state that have been directly impacted by this and have lost their jobs or been forced to quit or retire early because of things that were beyond their control. So we ask, that you speak to your legislators, tell them that you support the bill. We will be doing a email call to action shortly about this issue once the bills are introduced. So we'll be asking everybody to send emails to the legislators as well, telling them that you support this as much as possible. Um, I think that's it on my end.
Man, appreciate that, Ken. That was actually valuable information, but I think one thing stood out to me more than anything is the fact that you said we're not asking for blankets, we're asking for common sense change. That was real as it can get because like I didn't even realize there was such a shortage. I did know that the industry was growing in that direction and would need a lot of nurses and a lot of nurses aides and people that could work in the industry. My fiance is in the industry, so I have heard that, but man, the opportunity there is amazing. That's
Absolutely. I mean,
100%.
the reality is this, in all fairness, we've got people sitting on their couches at home that can't work because of systemic barriers that prevent them from actually doing what they were trained to do. Right.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of it. Right. And these systemic barriers are not common sense when we look at it in the overall scheme of things. I remember, a couple years ago, we did listening sessions across the state with MDHS, and some of the horror stories that we heard from employers about how they had to let go of employees because of systemic barriers. Like that's difficult to hear when, somebody's livelihood is being affected by this, or, a family that uh, their favorite caregiver had to be let go,
Mhm.
because of some things that they had no control over. That's difficult when on both ends, as from hearing it from employers and hearing it from people that were directly impacted by uh, a lot of these rules.
Got you. Got you. And I definitely noticed a question in the chat. I want to. We're going to hear now from CEO, Center for Employment Opportunities, from Sam Hanna with a presentation on income supported reentry.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Pleasure to be here. Really happy to be able to talk to you all today. Yes, I'm Sam Hanna, Director of Policy and Business Development for Center for Employment Opportunities work in Michigan. Briefly, Center for Employment Opportunities is a nationwide nonprofit that provides an immediate job, daily pay, wraparound vocational services for people coming home from incarceration. We are heavily focused on what we're calling income supported reentry. So effectively cash assistance for folks when they come home from incarceration. In Michigan, our focus is on, at the moment anyway, piloting a use for TANF dollars to support folks coming home from incarceration if they're coming home to a household where they have dependents. TANF is temporary assistance for needy families. It's a federal block grant that provides temporary cash assistance for things like job training, supportive services for low-income families with children. We are focused on TANF for a couple of reasons. One of the main reasons is, I think, as of 2022 or 2023, the state is sitting on about $100 million of leftover TANF funds that can be allocated to uh, different projects that the state defines. We're also focused on TANF because states get to define what needy is. Um, and TANF's purposes are relatively broad. So there are four main categories in which states get to allocate these TANF dollars. One is assisting families in need, so children can be cared for in their homes or homes of relatives. Number two is reducing dependency of parents in need by promoting job preparation, work and marriage. Number three is preventing pregnancies among unmarried persons, and number four is encouraging the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. So, relatively broad uses or broad terms there. And that we feel gives us an opportunity to work with the state to leverage those dollars to support individuals coming home from incarceration that fit into those buckets. The main way that we are going to position this pilot is the use of something under TANF called NRSTs, which is non-recurring short-term benefits, which can be applied to individuals that are in a crisis situation. And the crisis situation that we're positioning here is coming home from incarceration. So individuals that are coming home, we we heard from other presenters today just about the difficulties in finding housing, finding employment, just getting stable vital documents, things like that. Of course, money in somebody's pockets upon release would help with all of those things, in addition to supporting a traditional household, I guess we should say. Um, we are seeing that other states have utilized TANF dollars in very similar ways, but also very creative ways for workforce development and ways to support families. Not so much use from a very specific criminal justice perspective, but all of those different states that are using these dollars in creative ways gives us hope that we can leverage not only MDHHS, but the legislature to move in this direction. So at the moment now, we're in the sort of exploratory phase, the pilot phase. Had conversations with the Department of Corrections, had conversations with labor and other reentry providers around the state, all of which have come up very positive. Everybody sees this as a real opportunity, sees the need, and understands that this can be very, impactful use of federal dollars. I believe one of my colleagues on this call already mentioned, but in Michigan, 1 in 10 kids have an incarcerated parent. 72% of families report experiencing financial challenges after somebody's released from incarceration. 60% of people have been incarcerated or persistently unemployed for over a year, up to a year after their release. Again, I kind of always come back to like money in people's pockets is a real simple way to support folks and to solve a lot of these problems, or at least give somebody a boost. Um, so we're also noticing that there's been significant success from the RX Kids program in the state of Michigan, which is also leveraging some TANF dollars in those NRSTs, those non-recurring short-term payments. So our proposal at the moment is that we can potentially provide up to $3,000 for folks coming home from incarceration in their first 3 months. We feel that we're in a position where we can hopefully shape how the MDHHS carves this out. But also, of course, like I said, we're in the early stages. We're piloting these conversations. We're piloting this. We don't have legislation written or bill language written just yet, but we do see that on the horizon. Our next step at CEO is to have conversations with MDHHS. We have heard that there's a low likelihood that things will happen this year directly from MDHHS. However, we still need to have these conversations about what the mechanisms of action need to be within the agency. We're going to leverage relationships that we have with the legislature now, also develop stronger relationships on both sides of the aisle for folks who are, sitting on the DHHS committee and folks who have a stake in this work. Michigan's not super heavily invested in criminal justice work this year, but it does seem that there's an opportunity to, from my perspective, there's always an opportunity to move the needle. Positioning this as a pilot seems like a pretty great way to do that. I think our call to action at the moment, my counterpart Kari Larise is in this meeting as well. She'll put her email in the chat, but our call to action is if you have stories from the people that you are serving within your own programs, if you're a justice impacted person and you can share how, if this cash assistance, this income supported reentry would have benefited you upon your release in your first couple of months, we'd love to hear it. We need as many of these stories as we can to help sort of hammer the point home of the need here, and also help us like carve out what this can look like for the state. So if you have, obviously also suggestions, questions, comments, please don't hesitate to reach out in the chat now or reach out to us directly via email.
Appreciate that, Sam. Man, so listening to your presentation right after having heard Ken say he didn't get any pushback, or we're not hearing any pushback on theirs, I can imagine the pushback you're hearing on the use of TANF funds for formerly incarcerated. So I definitely appreciate that uphill battle that you guys are fighting for or walking for us
Thank you.
on that level. That being said, hopefully, I think she's ready now. Want to set you guys up to hear from Ali Fonsetti from prison fellowship to discuss professional licensing pre-approval. You ready, Allie? Floor is yours.
Thank you. And hello, everyone. Ali Alfonsetti, legislative strategist for Prison Fellowship. I do our advocacy work in Michigan and Ohio, and I am based out of Metro Detroit. And I'm here to talk about our work on occupational licensing. I just want to make sure everyone can see the slides. Great. Thank you. So wanted to fill you all in on what Prison Fellowship is if you're not familiar with what we do and what I get to do on our work. So our mission is to encounter Jesus with those impacted by incarceration. And our vision is envisioning a revival of the church inside and outside of prison that brings justice, mercy, and hope to our culture. What we get to do outside of our ministry areas is advocating for justice reform and advancing justice that restores. So we work to mobilize Christians to advocate for a restorative approach to justice that advances proportional punishment, constructive prison culture, and second chances. We also are big proponents of Second Chance Month. Every April, it's a nationwide campaign to help unlock second chances, bring lots of notoriety. And we usually do, as you can see on the slide here, a big Capitol Hill Day with our justice ambassadors and our volunteers and faith leaders who are passionate about these issues and get to share on Capitol Hill, as well as I always try to do one almost every year in Lansing as well. So a little bit of background about occupational licensing and why Prison Fellowship is so passionate about this issue. So looking at returning from home rates, I know probably many of you guys on this call are very familiar, but on a national level, 95% of the current incarcerated population in the US will reintegrate back into society. In Michigan, substantially lower, roughly 86% of the incarcerated population in Michigan will reintegrate into society. Still a high number, but in comparison to the national one, it is really interesting to see as we have some of those longer sentence times. And then unemployment rates. So we had a great conversation from Safe and Just on what they're working on in the healthcare space, which is phenomenal. And I know Ken and John at Safe and Just have been working really diligently on that legislation for a few years now. But looking at unemployment rates, formerly incarcerated individuals have between the ages of 25 and 44 unemployed or actively looking for a job. And currently the Michigan unemployment rate from the most recent data is roughly about 5%. Now that number does not include those who have actually already exhausted their benefits. So we do understand that that number there carries a little bit of a larger weight. So all that being said, there's some key facts we'd love to share. So currently there's over 15,000 legal barriers preventing a person with a criminal record from obtaining a license. And today, 1 in 4 jobs requires a license, some form of occupational license. And here in Michigan, we have over probably almost 300 licenses across 3 different occupational codes. So we have the occupational licenses within the occupational code. We have occupational licenses that fall within the public health code. And then we also have occupational licenses that fall under the Skilled Trades Regulation Act. So we have these 3 different codes that all contain all these different occupational licenses. About 50% of formerly incarcerated individuals make no reported income in the 1st or 4th year after release. And that's really disheartening because we know that having an opportunity to work is crucial during that time of reentry. And the unemployment rate is nearly 5 times higher for those formerly incarcerated than the general US population. So a little bit more about our position, what we're working on this legislature. So when determining whether to grant occupational license, consideration of criminal records should be based on a direct relationship between the criteria, the crime in question and a specific license being requested. So we want to make sure that if somebody is being denied a license due to criminal history, it needs to make sense. It can't just be a blanket denial. And that's what we're trying to do by doing some fixes within the legislation. So this is proposed legislation that we are currently in the drafting phase with a Senate sponsor. So we're hoping that we're on the last leg of going back and forth with the legislative drafters. So one crucial part is legislative oversight. Currently, the department creates an annual report on a small portion of the occupational licenses that shows how many licenses were denied due to criminal history. The legislation would expand this report to include all of the licenses. Right now, it's roughly 20, and you can find those on Lara's site. If you're curious, I'm happy to send that link too. Predetermination process. And so currently in each of those three codes I mentioned, the Public Health Code, Occupational Code, and the Skilled Trades Regulation Act, there is a predetermination process where an individual can seek predetermination on whether their criminal history would affect their ability to obtain a license before training and education. Well, however, this determination is not binding on a licensing board. This legislation will ensure that a positive predetermination is binding. So ensuring that if it is adverse, then they can have an opportunity to reconsider. But if it is positive, then they cannot change their mind when somebody actually goes to seek that license after obtaining their training and education, which we know is a lot of money, time, and resources that exist when trying to pursue an occupational license. And then criminal history consideration. Quality criminal history protections for occupational licensing were put into place in 2020, but they do not apply to every license in our state. This legislation will apply to the standards enacted in 2020 across all three of the occupational codes. So that is what we're working on, baby steps to just creating a better and more transparent environment for occupational licensing. And if you're interested in joining kind of what we get to do in our grassroots movement and becoming a justice ambassador, you can see our website there, prisonfellowship.org/justice ambassador, or you can scan the QR code. And you can go through that process. If you are interested in becoming an advocate and just receiving our call to action emails, feel free to go to prisonfellowship.org and look for our advocacy page, and there is a chance to set up. And if you can't find that, please email me and I'm happy to share all of that. But, we always know that our lawmakers hear better when they actually hear from those who have been impacted by incarceration and reentry. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ali. Those numbers were staggering, to say the least. I had to take a couple pictures of my screen. Yeah, so I appreciate you for that. To round us off is Chuck Warpahoski from MI-CEMI. He will be discussing some of the budget implications and vital docs and achievement credits. So, Chuck, the floor is yours. You ready?
I want to talk a little bit about vital documents. And I want to start by telling many of you know this guy, Jose Burgos, amazing guy, former juvenile lifer. Here he is at the Reentry Summit MI-CEMI hosted a couple years ago. And similar to what Cam was talking about people who get resentenced, not having access to documents, Jose was born in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico, U.S. territory, he's a U.S. citizen. But when he came home, he was actually on paper, he was on parole. And so, like most people who come home on parole, you're told, okay, get a job, open a banking account, get an apartment. Well, like Cam was saying, you can't do that without your vital documents. You can't do that if you don't have a driver's license or state ID. But even though the state of Michigan knew who Jose was, they had sent him to die in prison and he resentenced him because of the Supreme Court perspective. When he came home, he only had his parolee ID. He didn't have his actual state ID or birth certificate. And so the only way he could get a job as a U.S. citizen was to work under the table because he didn't have those vital documents. And Puerto Rico is actually fairly notorious for being slow to send birth certificates and stuff from the island to the mainland. When I started at MI-CEMI 4 or 5 years ago, this Jose's story was extremely common. When you talk to reentry organizations, this was one of the number one pain points they saw. They told us about is it's just so hard to get people started up and running when they're coming home without these vital documents. over the last couple of years between the Department of Corrections and the Secretary of State, we've made tremendous improvement in terms of having people come home with their state IDs or their driver's license and social security cards. But for those of you who've been around government, you know just because something's working now does not mean that it's going to work in 6 months, a year, 2 years. So MI-CEMI has been working with CEO and some other partners to pass some legislation that would strengthen the policy procedures for providing vital documents. We actually passed these bills in this House and the Senate last year during lame duck, but there was a technical issue where they conflicted with a bill that would also provide for automatic voter registration when people exit prison, also a really important issue. And because of that technical conflict, these bills were actually vetoed after the legislative term last year. So we're trying again. We have a bipartisan of House members who are making these bills. That again would create that legislative framework so that the improvements we've seen on vital documents don't backtrack. I see this as the next step, getting the administrative procedures improved with step one, getting this locked in with legislation is step two, and then from this, the beyond where we want to keep going is to change the procedures so that the process of securing vital documents doesn't start when somebody's up for parole. It starts when they're admitted, because as we know, with people who are exonerated or resentenced or win on appeal, sometimes that reentry window that works for most people coming home doesn't work for everybody. So starting earlier is how this campaign will build. Um, Similar to the request for stories that Allie and Sam asked for, one piece that would really help us is if you have stories, especially recent stories. Again, 5 years ago, this was almost everybody's story. But now, or not, maybe that's overstating it, but it was a very common story. Now it's less common, but still being able to say, here are the people falling through the cracks. Here's why it is so important to make sure people are re-entry ready day one of coming home, not after a couple of weeks when the state finally catches up with getting them vital documents. That's going to help us convey to the lawmakers that this is a real issue. And Laurice from CEO, who dropped the request for stories for the TANF money, has been doing amazing work with CEO to also help do story collection and curation on this. So reach out to Kari if you have any questions or if you've got a great story on that. It might be your own story. It might be a friend. If you work for a reentry service organization, it might be a client. CEO is able to both help support the people as they tell that story, as well as to compensate people for that story sharing work. In addition to that, um, Kari and Simone from the CEO team are just about ready to drop a communications toolkit that has some additional information about this, calls to action, link tree type, list of resources. We'll send that out to the list of people who are on this reentry table. So once that's ready, please share it on social media. If you have an email newsletter, share it on social media. Help us get the word out about these legislation. This should be a no-brainer. We've got a bipartisan group of uh, members of the House who are working on this. It is a clear way to help make sure that when people come home, they're able to get to work and give back to their community. It should be easy, but in this current legislative environment, even the easy things are hard. So the more we're able to message on this, the more we're able to say, hey, let's help people get back to work and rebuild their lives. All of that help really matters. The other thing I wanted to mention, as we talk about a climate where even the easy things are hard, is state funding for reentry. When Cam shared earlier, he talked about how there's existing OS reentry services that a number of people benefit from that are state funded. Um, Now, the challenge is last year when the budget process starts with the governor saying, here's my proposal. I'm going to put my proposal on the table. And then the House passes a budget, the Senate passes a budget, the House and Senate agree on a shared budget, and then it goes to the governor. The governor's proposal last year was to increase reentry support by $7 million. The Senate said, okay, we're not going to increase it. We're going to hold the base reentry supports stable, but we also want to add in some additional money for peer-led reentry. The House came back and said, wait, no, we're not going to increase the money. We're going to cut it by $8 million. And after all the negotiations landed, where we ended up with was a $5 million cut from what's called offender success in the state budget. I know some of you are familiar with offender success. Usually you'll hear me just calling it OS because I don't believe in calling people offenders. I don't think you set somebody up by success by putting that negative label on them from jump. So the state reentry funds were cut under that compromise budget. That was last year. This year, what we're looking at the state level is a projected $1 billion revenue shortfall for the state. There are going to have to be cuts across the board to balance the budget. That means we are playing defense this year when it comes to funding for reentry, to diversion funding that keeps people out of prison, prison education that helps set people up for success. This is going to be a really difficult year from a policy perspective, from a budget perspective. So it's going to have to be all hands on deck, not to fight for continued reentry funding. So one way that you can help is in the nonprofit sector, we have a tendency to kind of hide the pain, right? Like we put a good face on, okay, everything's working, everything's working. If you have stories though that help us highlight what the real challenge is, the harm caused by the current cuts, those stories matter for helping say why not to make further cuts. I'm going to be upfront with this. The stories that are most affected are how the funding for reentry cuts affect people other than the returning citizen, right? Tony was saying earlier about how the housing barriers for returning citizens don't just harm the returning citizens, they harm the kids, they harm the families, people who never committed a crime, never have a conviction. They're the ones getting hurt. It's the same kind of stories that are more effective. There's a stigma around being formerly incarcerated. We want to challenge that stigma, but we also want to set up the stories that people are predisposed to hear, and that includes the stories of folks who aren't also carrying a past conviction. But any of those stories that you're able to share, please drop it to us, reach out to MI-CEMI so that we can help document that. And then the other piece is that there are a couple of players who are especially impactful in setting the budget discussions this year. The way the chain of command works on the budget negotiations in the legislature is in the Senate, there's a Senate Majority Leader. In the House, there's a Speaker of the House. They appoint a chair for the appropriations committees. Those are the ones who propose the budget. And then within those appropriations committees, they're covering everything. They're covering schools, they're covering roads, they're covering parks, they're covering state police. They're looking at all of it. So there's subcommittees that deal with specific things. So when we're talking about reentry funding, that's in the appropriations subcommittee. Sorry to get a little bit technical here, but if we don't understand how the game is played, we're going to lose the game, right? Where the challenge is especially on the budget is in the House. And so who we're particularly targeting to try to convince of the importance of reentry funding is the House Appropriations Committee Chair, Representative Ann Bolin. She's in the Brighton area, Brighton, Walled Lake, Wixom. If you know people, if you're from her neck of the woods, either directly in her district or adjacent, or if you know people who have some of these powerful stories that are in her district, being able to make it local and personal to her matters, right? And then the other person, so she's the Appropriations Committee Chair, and then the subcommittee chair is Representative Bradley Slaw and he's out of the Hudsonville, Zeeland, Granville area on the west side of the state. kind of near Holland. So if you've got folks in his district who would be able to help make this case, he would be the other person that we're really trying to target and make sure he understands. Representative Slaw in particular, I'll say, has been very thoughtful on issues like this in the past. He worked with Safe and Just Michigan and other partners to help reduce phone fees so incarcerated people could stay in closer touch with their families. So he's somebody who is thoughtful on these issues. And the more he's hearing about people, especially people in his district who are impacted by it, it helps, it can help there. So that's what I've got on the budget issues as well as the vital documents legislation. And with that, I will kick it back over to Michael for the discussion.
I had a
Leslie.
question. A check went passive, but I didn't quite get it. Um, there was legislation and then it was rescinded because of a technicality. Do you have more information about that or?
So it's on the vital docs legislation to strengthen the procedure for the Department of Corrections and the Department of State to be able to help somebody get their state ID or driver's license while they're still incarcerated, so they're able to have that in hand when they hit the streets coming home. That passed the House during the normal things. It went over to the Senate. The Senate passed it. There's a period after the election before where lawmakers maybe they lost their jobs in the election, but they're still on the job until the end of the year. That period between the election and the end of the year is called lame duck. Um, so the Senate passed those bills through in the lame duck period. But because they got kind of rushed in the mix of everything, nobody took the time to double check to say, hey, we also passed this legislation saying that people can get registered to vote by MDOC as they're coming home as well. So two different bills were affecting the same part of the law. And so the legal advice the governor's office received was only one of these can go through. You can't have these conflicting amendments go through without having been cleaned up ahead of time. And so she chose to let the automatic voter registration bill go through and then vetoed the vital documents bill. So we're trying again. We've got a bipartisan set of lawmakers who are on board with this bill this time. So we think we've got, again, the Speaker of the House is very proud that the House passed the fewest number of new laws last year ever on the record of a state. He thinks that as a conservative, that limited action is a victory. And so even things that are small, bipartisan, common sense, technical fixes like that, he's been he has not prioritized them and has kind of taken not passing a lot of these, what he considers smaller bills, as a badge of honor. So even though from a policy perspective, everybody's fine with this, whether or not we'll be able to get it through is unsure. And a lot of it depends on are we able to say, hey, this is a common sense policy that um, if you're progressive, you can get behind it because it's helping expand economic opportunity. And if you're conservative, you can get behind it because this is helping make sure people are getting back to work. Whatever your political ideology, you can get behind this legislation and then being able to show that why it's actually important and not just chasing a problem.
I appreciate you showing up and supporting, being a part of this learning community. Um, I think a lot of the work that we do collaboratively leads to the bigger picture work being done. So thank you so much.